final exam. Okay, pep talk over. Chapter 16, your textbook does a really good job of laying out the innate immune system. So I highly encourage you to read through chapter 16 in your book, and as well as watching this lecture and using your slides. Okay, I outlined all of the information from chapter 16 in these slides. My goal is to make it even more clear than your textbook. Okay, so it is going to be very repetitive from your textbook for this chapter 16. Okay, chapter 17, on the other hand, I'm going to take another look at it, but I tend to recall feeling that it was disorganized, and so we'll probably really simplify chapter 17, do our own slides independent from the book for that. All right, so we'll review concepts, terms of immunity, and then we will jump into the first 3 types of innate immunity, called the first line of defense. And then in part 2, we'll go over the second line of defense, which are the defensive cells of the innate immune system and how those work. And then we'll talk about inflammation and fever, and then end with antimicrobial substances. Okay. So at the end of this first section, you should be able to compare and contrast immunity and susceptibility, innate and adaptive immune systems. You should be able to tell me what TLRs, toll-like receptors, are. You should be able to tell me what PAMPs are, and what this role is in immunity. And then lastly, you should be able to define cytokines, the term cytokines. Okay, so susceptibility means that you are able to become infected, right? So you have a lack of resistance. You do not have the ability to prevent or fight off the disease. Now, this can be a little complicated because, for example, if you haven't had an infection or a vaccine previously, you are then susceptible to it. But it doesn't mean that you're not going to be able to eventually fight off the infection and survive. But it does mean that there's always that chance, right? So you're susceptible to all sorts of diseases right now, but you're also immune to all sorts of diseases due to already having had them or having the vaccine, right? So all of these terms, you have to be very careful how you use them, what the situation is, right? Be as detailed as possible to make sure that you're using the terms correctly, okay? The immune system overall is all of the different systems within an organism that helps to prevent or fight disease. And for us, we break this into 2 larger systems, innate and adaptive. And so again, when we're talking about human immunity and the immune system, it can be complex, and we have to be very careful. So immunity, in a broad sense, just means the ability to ward off disease. And all these diseases are caused by microbes. So nothing that we're talking about is genetic, right? So only talking about infectious disease. So if you're immune, you are protected and cannot become infected by that particular microorganism. And that's the whole concept behind vaccination, right? You've been exposed to some antigens in one way or another, different methods to get to that point, but eventually you have the antigen from the pathogen and your body makes antibodies. And then if you ever come in contact with it again, you already have those antibodies and you'll immediately clear it, and you won't even have symptoms because no infection actually can persist. Now, again, if you don't already have the vaccine or have already had that infection, then you are technically susceptible. It doesn't mean you're going right. It's not doesn't mean you don't have an immune system that will eventually fight it and clear it off. Okay, so just being careful here. Now, another complication is that there are some pathogens where we, for different reasons, are not able to make memory responses, and memory responses are what provides long-term immunity, such as antibodies, and some other cells can have memory and fight off future infection. So a lot of STDs, for example, so sexually transmitted infections, tend to not give you any long-term protection. So if you've had, chlamydia, for example, you can keep getting it over and over again. And that might be the case for every single sexually transmitted infection, just the nature of the anatomy. And so this is another reason why it's important to have regular, yearly doctor physicals with your physician, and have all the regular screening. Of course, if you suspect that you've been exposed, you would go in immediately and get tested and request, full panel. And of course, if you have any symptoms of any kind, you would also go to the doctor and get that checked out. So don't wait for your yearly examination, but don't skip your, a lot of people say, I feel fine, I don't have anything wrong, I don't need a yearly physical. And that's not true. The yearly physical is the best way to make sure everything's working as it should be working, and that you can stay healthy. And if something is wrong, catch it as early as possible and get you back into to good health. Okay, so yearly physicals, don't skip them. All right, so innate immunity means a non-specific or general response. It's a default set of defenses. It doesn't matter what kind of pathogen it is, your body's going to respond, and you have this present at birth. It's always available, and it's really rapid. Within an hour of an invasion, you'll have a full innate response. Okay, so it's general, not specific. It doesn't matter which type of virus or which type of bacteria, right? Any microbe will cause the same innate response. So another component of innate immunity is that there's no memory. It's not giving you any long-term protection. It's just an immediate response to try to prevent microbes from multiplying into large numbers. And you can kind of think of this as trying to prevent infection, but also trying to buy yourself time for your adaptive immune system to kick in. Okay. Innate immunity involves things like chemical and physical barriers and responses factors, as well as our normal microbiota, which we'll talk about. On the other hand, the adaptive immune system takes time. It's a very powerful system, and our body has to be very certain that it's functioning correctly. And then it has to synthesize all of these very specific proteins, multiply cells. And so it takes about 7 to 10 days for this whole process of adaptive immunity to form. It's super specific. It will only help you against that one particular microbe. You could be infected by all sorts of other microbes, right? As you know already. And adaptive immunity typically forms this memory response that will give you long-term immunity. But there are all sorts of exceptions. I already mentioned the sexually transmitted diseases. And for other diseases, we find that our body just for some reason isn't good at making a super large amount of antibodies or memory cells. And that, for example, you get a booster vaccination of tetanus every 10 years, about, and other booster vaccines occasionally. And then some of our vaccines, we just get them one time, and that's good enough. So it is very variable how long-term the protection is, if you form it at all. Okay, but in general, we'll say that the adaptive immune response provides your long-term protection. Okay, so our focus in this part 1 video is the innate immune system. So I just want to re-emphasize the innate immunity does not recognize specific pathogens. It is a general response by our physical and chemical factors and by our innate white blood cells to these foreign cells or material, right? Because you can have allergies, which are just innate, materials like dust, pollen, etc. But our body treats it as though it was a pathogen. And then, so that's a time when your immune system's not working correctly and goes after something that's harmless, and that can cause allergies. We won't really be talking about that too much. Okay, so responses of the innate system. How does your innate system get activated? Some of the innate immune system is just always present, always being made, and we'll be talking about that first, the physical and chemical factors. And then the second line of defense of the innate immune system is activated when protein receptors are triggered. So you have protein receptors in these white blood cells of the innate immune system. These receptors are called toll-like receptors, TLR, okay? And so our innate white blood cells have these toll-like receptors, and if they get triggered, then your second line of defense, these defensive cells kick into action, kick into gear. So what triggers them? We call them PAMPs, P-A-M-P, and that stands for pathogen-associated molecular patterns. So the host, your body, has white blood cells like neutrophils, just the different phagocytic cells, and those cells have these special receptors called toll-like receptors. And if any part of a pathogen, such as flagella, LPS, peptoglycan of the cell wall, right? Any of these parts of pathogens come into contact with a toll-like receptor, then the alarm, right? The alarm goes off. The alarm being the release of cytokines. So TLRs induce defensive cells to release cytokines. And really what that should say is activated or triggered TLRs induce defensive cells to release cytokines. And so the common question on a test would be, what causes TLRs to release cytokines? And of course the answer would be PAMPs. Any of the pathogen-associated molecular patterns, LPS, flagella, right? All of this list here, all these different parts of pathogens can trigger a TLR. And then the TLR is going to cause the cell to release cytokines. There are a lot of different kinds of cytokines throughout our body. So there will be a special subset of cytokines released in this situation that will cause the immune response. And so one of these responses would be to activate and like kind of turn on the phagocytic activity of, I put here macrophages, and we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later, but macrophages start out as monocytes. Monocytes travel throughout the blood, and then if cytokines are present, they will go into the tissue. The monocytes will go into the tissue, and then they'll become activated and turn into macrophages. And Cytokines can also activate and turn on the adaptive immune system to get that process started. Okay, so it's not one or the other, and it's not one and then the other, but really innate and adaptive immunity work hand in hand simultaneously. Although overall, we could say that the adaptive immune system takes, 7 to 10 days, but there are going to be lots of processes happening during that time. And so we cannot completely separate innate and adaptive immunity, but that's how we try to do it, to teach it for simplicity's sake. Okay, so for the innate immune system, we break it into first line of defense and second line of defense. First line of defense are the physical, chemical factors and the normal microbiota. The second line of defense, which will be in part 2, will be the defensive cells, inflammation, fever, and antimicrobial substances. So make sure you can answer all these check your understanding questions after you have listened to the lecture and read the book. Okay, so for this next section, we're going to talk about the skin and the mucous membranes as physical and chemical factors of the first line of defense. So physical factors include barriers such as the skin, that prevent the entry of microbes into the body. And then there's also factors that remove microbes when they do gain access to the body. Okay, so examples of physical factors are intact, healthy skin, mucous membranes. The mucus itself traps the microbes and then is removed. Nose hairs also can trap microbes sometimes as well, although nose hairs mostly trap larger particles like dust. You have cilia in the lower respiratory system that constantly sweep mucus up and out of the lower respiratory tract to keep it clear. You have in your eyes, right, constantly exposed to the air and all the microbes in the air. And so you have your tears that are constantly removing those microbes. And then, of course, saliva, urine, vaginal secretions, earwax, and even the hairs of the ear are all there to physically remove any microbes that are present. And then, of course, your epiglottis blocks off your airway so that when you swallow, everything goes into your digestive tract, and so that protects your respiratory system. Peristalsis keeps everything moving in one way. And then, of course, you eventually everything exits the body. If there is an infection, if something goes wrong, you can vomit or have diarrhea to try to very rapidly eliminate the microbes from the GI tract. Okay, so the skin is pretty amazing. It's our largest organ, and it has a few characteristics that provide us perhaps the most protection against infection, right? Of course, we have entry points still, right? The mouth, the nose, the eyes, and our mucous membranes are still some ways that microbes can get into the body. But for the most part, we have this amazing barrier, the skin, that keeps everything out, right? New skin replaces old skin cells. And so not only do we have this barrier, but we have a barrier that's constantly being shed and replaced. So even when microbes are on your skin and starting to colonize, it would be hard for them to fully colonize because they're shed with the old skin cells. So the skin, you look at your hands, look at your arms, the skin you see now will be gone in about a month. And that's really cool. Okay, so the dermis is the thicker, deeper layers of the skin. It's composed of connective tissue, and it's constantly producing cells. And these cells begin plump, like what you normally think of as cells. They're living, they're plump. But as they move up to the higher layers of your skin, right, to the epidermis, they begin to flatten out, and they also begin to then produce keratin and get ready to die. And so the epidermis, those top layers, are going to be tightly packed. You have a middle and a top layer. So you have the dermis, the very bottom layer, you have a middle layer of epidermis, and then you have a top layer of epidermis. So you have the 3 layers of skin: dermis, middle epidermis, top epidermis. Okay. And the epidermis, all of these cells are tightly packed. And in the middle layer, you have cells that are still alive, and they're starting to produce keratin. Keratin is very important. It's a protein. It helps keep your skin dry and very tough, right? Tough is in kind of on the microscopic level, right? Not so much what we tend to think of. And so the very top 18 to 23 layers of your skin are actually dead cells that are completely covered in the keratin. So we call them keratinized cells. And this is what helps keep your skin dry as well, as a barrier, right? And so this dryness of the top layers of your skin and their continual shedding are very important in protecting you against pathogens. Microbes rarely, if ever, penetrate intact skin. Okay. So then you have to think about, well, what about if it's not dry, right? What if you live in a very moist, warm climate? Or what if you have just exercised or had a lot of physical exertion and you're very sweaty? Okay, then you are making, your skin is now more susceptible, and fungal infections are very common. This is why it's very important after exercise or after becoming sweaty that you, at the very least, change your clothing so that your clothing is dry, and the thought there is then your skin will also dry out. Best practice would be to be able to rinse off, dry off, and then put on fresh clothes. And if you live in a hot, humid climate, there might not be a whole lot you can do other than having very breathable clothes that can dry rapidly, and trying to, take breaks, making sure to, take care of your skin the best you can to avoid this. But fungal infections will be the most common type of skin infection for moist skin, because once the fungi land on the skin and they have water available, they have enzymes that can break down the keratin, and then they can get underneath your top layers, they can get into your middle and even into your bottom layers of your skin and cause infections. And they're typically not serious infections. They're usually just more a nuisance, right? Like athlete's foot, ringworm. But if someone has a weak immune system, then these fungal infections can actually become very life-threatening. Now, staphylococci bacteria are the most common bacteria or the most common infection period when skin is not intact. So instead of thinking about it, the dryness issue, if the issue is that your skin has been compromised, you have a cut or a wound, then it's very susceptible to all sorts of infection. And the most common infection would then be the staphylococci, because you do have a lot of staphylococci constantly on your skin. And so then that's an opportunistic infection. Okay, so again, keeping your skin dry and keeping it intact are very important in preventing infection. So here's what the skin looks like. I'm sure you're familiar with this. You took anatomy, but remember that those very top layers are super dense, flat, highly compact, dead, keratinized cells. And then the middle layers, they're in between, they're still alive, they're producing the keratin, they're becoming more and more flat as they rise to the surface. And then of course, underneath that, you have the dermis, which are just completely plump, living new cells that are just starting their journey. You also have all sorts of other components of your skin, right? Like you have all of your sweat glands, nerve endings. Underneath that, you have your fatty tissue. And so, you know, we won't really be talking about these other components of the skin, but I did want to just take a moment, one, to remind you about some of the anatomy that you've already learned, and two, just to appreciate how amazing our skin is, right? So in just 1 inch of skin, and as scientists, we really shouldn't be using inches. We should be thinking in terms of, you know, the metric system. So 2.54 centimeters of skin, you have about 19 million skin cells, 650 sweat glands, 20 blood vessels, 1,000 or more nerve endings, and 60,000 or more specialized cells that make your skin color. And so this is amazing, right? Just in such a small space, you can have so much happening. And I think this is really good for you because you already learned your skin anatomy. You're very familiar with this. This helps put it things on the cellular or microscopic level back into perspective. I know that that's one of the challenges with this course is the scale of things and getting used to thinking of everything, all these tiny, tiny parts, right? Okay, so more physical factors of our innate immune system, the first line of defense. Physical removal. Okay, so let's say they get past the barrier or they're in some other area of the body. We need to trap them and we need to remove them. So our mucous membranes, such as your eyes and your nose, right, consist of epithelial layers, and then underneath that you have the underlying connective tissue. And this is a major component of your first line of defense, right? So your eyes, your nose, in your mouth, throat, right, throughout your gastrointestinal system, your respiratory system, and your genital urinary tracts, right? All of these are vulnerable to exposure of microbes, right? These are the areas that are not protected by the skin that we were just talking about. Okay, so we rely on mucus to constantly coat our mucous membranes, and that mucus needs to be removed so that we can remove the trapped microbes, right? Then you have your nose hairs and your ear hairs, right? Things we mentioned already that can also help to trap particles as well. But most importantly, of all of these, I would say would be the ciliary escalator. The air is full of microbes, and you're breathing constantly all sorts of microbes as well as other particles. And so we have this very, very important system called the ciliary escalator, where the cilia constantly sweep mucus up and out of the respiratory system. It goes towards your throat. You swallow it throughout the day. You don't even know. And it's great. Okay, so in your, remember your anatomy, you have your goblet cells of the mucous membrane. And the goblet cells in the respiratory epithelium secrete the mucus, and that mucus is what's sticky and traps the particles. But it's too sticky and difficult for the cilia to directly remove mucus. So actually what happens is that all the other cells besides the goblet cells are ciliated, right? They have all the cilia, all the very fine finger or hair-like projections. And those actually secrete sodium. They have these special chloride channels. They secrete sodium, and then water always follows the sodium ions, and this creates like a saline layer. And so the cilia are bathed in this saline layer, and then immediately on top of that will be the mucus. It's not really shown in this image here, but we'll see it in the video where we're going to watch two videos about this. And this is also this saline layer is also what people with cystic fibrosis are not able to create, and this is why they have so many problems. But we'll continue on with the regular function right now. So ciliated cells secrete sodium, water follows the sodium, and this creates the saline layer, and then the cilia beat they're synchronized with each other, and it makes this wave-like motion, propelling the saline and then the mucus on top of it. And then so that gets swept up towards the throat and swallowed. As I mentioned, for cystic fibrosis patients, they have an issue with that chloride channel. They're not able to make that saline layer. The mucus is very, very thick, is not going to be removed much at all. And this is why they're so prone to lung infections. Typically, they end up dying young from these lung infections. It's very sad. COPD patients, on the other hand, tend to be older, and not always, but tends to be the result of things like smoking or exposure to anything that has irritated the airway. And sometimes this can be autoimmune or other causes. It's not always because the person smoked, but it is common. And so they have these irritated airways, like the trachea and the bronchi, and they're inflamed and they're producing more mucus than normal. They also tend to have damaged cilia because the same irritants that irritated those airways have also damaged cilia. And so now they have a lot of mucus. It's hard for them to get rid of it. And then it's harder, there's less space for the air to flow through, for them to breathe. And it's also harder for them to clear their ciliary. Escalator is not going to be working as well. It's working overtime to try to clear all this extra mucus. And so they have a lot of difficulties kind of on more than one physiological level, right? Things like exercise are super great because it gives you these bursts of very heightened movement, right? So during exercise, you're breathing much faster. That's going to cause your cilia to be even faster and help clear your lungs. Coughing and sneezing will give a sudden burst to speed up the escalator as well. And it's very important that you're staying hydrated so that you have enough water to make that saline layer. This is one of the reasons that you're told to drink plenty of fluids when you're ill. Okay, so let's watch this first short clip on the ciliary clearance.
The air we breathe contains foreign matter such as dust, bacteria, and pollen. Hair-like cells called cilia, as well as goblet cells, can be found in the lining of the respiratory tract called the respiratory epithelium. Goblet cells secrete viscous mucus that forms a layer to trap foreign material. The wave-like action of the underlying cilia mobilizes the mucus layer, removing the foreign matter and preventing it from entering the lungs.
Okay, now our next slide. Yikes. Sorry about that, guys. Clicked on the wrong thing. Okay, so now I want you to see, this is a video made by some researchers. You get to see real footage, and also kind of explains a little bit more of the physiology of what's going on. So this one's a little bit longer, but I think it's better than the first one. Okay.
Mucociliary clearance is an important part of our respiratory defense mechanism. This mucus transport system clears foreign particles and bacteria from the airways. Over the next 20 minutes, we will see in video recorded by Dr. Stanislav Tatkov how this important mechanism is affected by temperature and humidity. But let's begin by reviewing where mucus clearance fits into the human respiratory system. Every day we breathe in more than 15,000 liters of air, enough to fill around 1,600 balloons. Even in the most pristine environments, that air is not clean and pure. We inhale thousands of dust, smoke, and virus particles, about 100 bacteria alone every minute. More than 150,000 contaminants each day that, if given free rein, can infect and clog the respiratory system. These foreign particles, viruses and bacteria, are trapped in an extremely sticky mucus layer lining the airways. Mucus carries the trapped material into the larynx in a process known as mucociliary clearance. The physiology of this clearance process isn't completely understood yet. Research continues, but let's take a close look at what we do know. We know that mucus transport to clear foreign particles is driven by motile cilia. Cilia are small tentacle-like structures with a diameter about 1,000 times smaller than a human hair, which beat in an asymmetric rhythm. Cilia protrude from most of the epithelial cells lining the airways, densely carpeting the respiratory tract. This was revealed by scanning electron microscope images. Size is indicated by this scale. The cilia are bathed in a watery fluid. The mucus layer, which traps debris, floats on top of this periciliary fluid, and as the cilia beat synchronously, the mucus layer moves, carrying along trapped particles. Now, the exact mechanism by which the cilia cause the mucus to move remains unclear, and it's the subject of intense research. This particular animation is based on the work of Gaber and Pryl. The cilia are shown here in slow motion. In a healthy person, they beat much faster, typically around 15 cycles every second, propelling the mucus about 10 millimeters every minute. Zooming out to a video microscopy recording of live tracheal tissue, you can see the tiny beating cilia as flicker throughout the image, and debris floating on the mucus layer as dark spots moving slowly across the field.
Now, you might be wondering, if the cilia are moving so quickly, why are the particles in this video moving slowly? Remember that the cilia are bathed in the saline layer, and then on top is the mucus. So it takes a lot more to propel that mucus across. But I wanted you to see just how amazing this system is. You can watch the rest of this video on your own. You have the link, and it'll talk a little bit about that moisture and temperature aspects of the ciliary escalator as well. Okay, so next, physical factors continued, it should say. So the physical removal, in addition to the mucous membranes that we just looked at and the ciliary escalator of the respiratory system, now we're thinking about the eye a little bit more. So that lacrimal apparatus, you have these glands on the outer side of your eyes, and they produce the tears, and the tears get spread over your eye as you blink, and then it drains into the canals and then to the duct. And this is why when you cry, your nose will become runny and you'll have to blow your nose. It's because all the excess tears drain here. Okay, so tears flow toward the nose. The glands are going to be on the opposite side, right? And it washes over when you blink. And we will see some chemical factors in tears as well. But right now we're trying to think of just physical. So just physical removal by the flow of fluid, okay? Saliva also physically, you have glands that produce your saliva, physically washes over your teeth, tongue, all of your mouth, and then you swallow it. Urine, same thing. It's a physical removal, any microbes that have gotten into your bladder or in your urethra should be removed by the physical flow of urine. Another reason why it's important to stay hydrated is so you have regular urination and removal of microbes. This is much more important for women than it is for men because of the short length of the urethra for women. Now, also for women, vaginal secretions are important to keep that flow and keep that removal of microorganisms as well. Okay, chemical factors. Now we're thinking things like pH and enzymes. Okay, not every system will have both, but a lot of times you will see both. So for the skin and vaginal secretions, they have a low pH, anywhere from 3 to 5, depending on the specific area. Your gastric juice in your stomach is even lower pH, anywhere from 1 to 3, so incredibly acidic. And then in perspiration, so sweat, tears, saliva, some of the secretions from the nose and urine will also contain an enzyme. So in addition to these low pHs that we just looked at, we have lysozyme, which is an enzyme that specifically breaks down peptidoglycan. So lysozyme is protecting you from bacteria only, and it's going to be better at protecting against gram positive than it will be gram negative, because remember, gram negative have that outer membrane. But once lysozyme comes in contact with peptidoglycan, it will break it down. How it does that, it's hydrolyzing the bonds between those NAG and NAM carbohydrate. So NAG and NAM are the monomers that make up the carbohydrate component of the peptidoglycan, and the lysozyme is going to split those bonds between NAG and NAM, and then you're going to have a weak cell wall, and then the cell will burst open, right? So other chemical factors, we have sebum. Your scalp and your face is going to produce sebum, which is an oily, even waxy, protective film over the scalp and face, and it will be slightly acidic. And so that's supposed to help control microorganisms as well. So this is interesting, because then you have to think about, oh, so am I over washing my face and scalp and causing my skin to be more susceptible? So this is something that people, manufacturers, have to test their products to make sure that you can remove your, the body odor and microorganisms, dirt, things, excess oils, but not be so harsh as to completely strip your skin of this protective layer, right? Earwax, this, in addition to being very sticky and trapping things, it also is made up of like some fatty acids, which have a natural antimicrobial property to them as being, acidic. Saliva, we talked about the lysozyme. And so there's also urea and uric acid in your saliva, which provides some inhibition to growth of microbes. And then you also have IgA, which is a type of antibody, which we will talk about in detail when we get to the adaptive immune system in chapter 17. But that helps prevent microbes from being able to attach to the mucous membrane by blocking their receptors. Okay, so saliva contains lots of components to protect you. Urine, we talked about the physical flow, but now we'll think about it's slightly acidic, so that's an inhibition of growth, and it contains lysozyme as well. Vaginal secretions, in addition to being slightly acidic, that's really, excuse me, they are slightly acidic because there's a breakdown of glycogen into lactic acid. And so that's how you get the slight acidity of those secretions. And then we talked about sweat or perspiration being containing lysozyme as well. So again, lysozyme is a very important enzyme that our body uses to inhibit bacterial infection. Now, our normal microbiota also give us protection. And so though we don't control our normal microbiota, and it's not technically our body, and so we cannot really say that the normal microbiota are part of our immune system directly, but they are important, and we should mention the effect that they have. And so we consider them innate because they're always present. And pardon me for sneezing, blowing my nose. Okay, so normal microbiota are going to have special adaptations that allow them to survive either on the surface of our skin or within our digestive tracts. For example, our gut contains an enormous amount of variety of bacteria that play a lot of very important roles in protecting us, and even other beneficial roles that we won't talk about today because it focuses the immune system. So commensalism just simply is a term meaning that there's two organisms living together. One of them is using the other as a physical environment for survival. So for example, we are the large organism, the bacteria are the small organism. Those bacteria are utilizing us as a physical environment to obtain nutrients and shelter from us, right? And we, the larger organism, is unharmed by these microorganisms that are just colonizing us and utilizing us for sometimes even for nutrients, such as in the gut, right? They're getting all their nutrients from our food that we eat, but they're not causing us any harm. So this is a commensalism. It doesn't always mean normal microbiota, right? Commensalism is a term in biology that can be applied in all sorts of scenarios, not just us and our microbiota. Okay, so microbiota benefit us in terms of immunity in three ways. There's the competitive aspect that they are going to outcompete pathogens for space and for nutrients. The normal microbiota are better adapted to us, our body, and they will be better at colonizing. Okay, so just their mere presence and competitive exclusion. Some of our normal microbiota will also directly fight pathogens. They don't want to give up their space. They don't want to give up their nutrients. And so they're going to fight off pathogens with antimicrobial substances. And so then that would be directly antagonistic. Then we have the very complex interactions that we're just starting to learn about as a field is this training of the immune system. So we know it's very, very important that babies and infants have a good gut flora to train the immune system. And when we've done all sorts of different types of studies, and it seems to be a very strong indication that allergies and autoimmune disorders and all sorts of other things can arise when babies do not have the right good variety of microorganisms. There's no one set, right? It's not like everyone should have this much of this kind, this much of that kind. There's so much variety that it's very difficult to try to define, but there are certain, we have learned certain things, like certain types of bacteria that we really shouldn't have as part of our gut flora, and then others that we should only have to a certain degree. They shouldn't be too numerous, right? And on the other hand, it also seems like the more variety, the better. So, and then on top of all that, there are certain types of bacteria that we've seen that are very good and beneficial and that we do want to see in our gut flora. So the study of the gut is ongoing, kind of consider it more of a new topic of microbiology and health. And so it's very exciting, very fascinating. And if you ever have extra time, read some peer-reviewed journal articles about the microbiome of the gut. Okay, so that is the end of this first video on the first line of defense of the innate immune system. Review everything, take a break, and then tune back in for part 2, which will be the second line of defense of the innate immune system. All right, good job. Bye.